Hello everyone. All right, politics. Let us recapitulate. I'm going to introduce to you, one of them you might already know actually, but I'm going to talk. I've been listening to French and American scholars talking about the war in Ukraine and the effect, first of all, on the European Union. And I'm going to share with you some of the things that a gentleman says. His name is François Assselinau, is the leader of the Union Populaire Republicaine in France. So we're going to talk about very quickly, 1 or 2, 5 minutes, on the effect, a general effect on the EU. He ends up saying that the European countries, Europe has become obviously a vassal state, can you say state, to the US. And then I'm going to go to the US and a very interesting video. This is obviously in English with an American professor of economics. This is from the video Dialogue Works. You might follow that. It's an excellent video channel. And the economics professor is Michael Hudson, the University of Wisconsin in Kansas City. He's also a Wall Street financial analyst, very experienced. And then I'm going to go back to the to Europe and speak with, not speak myself, just recap a little bit on what another French diplomat this time says, Jacques Baud. And he's going to talk about the attitude that the countries of Europe should adopt towards the latest conflict in Israel and Palestine. I found these three gentlemen extremely interesting. They explain things very well, and that is why I follow them. The first one, François Asselineau, I find him not only very knowledgeable, he's an elder gentleman, and he's been in politics. He goes back to the Gaul, so he's been there forever. And he's also very amusing in how he says things. And he starts by saying that the whole narrative about the Ukraine war and the war itself is collapsing before our eyes, he says. The narrative originally was that Russia was going to be beaten. It was going to be crushed as a power. That he says, oh my goodness, the narrative that we had to listen to. First of all, Putin was suffering from lung cancer, esophagus cancer, bone cancer, pancreatic cancer, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, a superiority complex, flat feet. All right, so he says, so Vladimir Putin was presented to us as this great big wolf and Ukraine as Little Red Riding Hood. He's very amusing, actually. He's very articulate. Anyway, so he just says, look, basically that Russia was going to have taken Crimea, and it was going to take Poland and then France and God knows what else. The Ukraine was going to be the bulwark of our democracy. So we started sending all our money. We had to give our money away until final victory. We all had to sacrifice. The budget had to be sacrificed to total collapse. practically. The media was obviously very complicit in all this, he argues. They never really explain how the whole thing started, how they never explained, he says, the reality. They never explained about the whole thing started on the 22nd of February 2022. They never explain, the whole history going back to the 18th century. They never explain the coup, the Maidan coup. They never explain the two Minsk agreements. Nothing. The whole thing started on the 22nd of February. He says there was a total complicity. He goes on and talks about the media. They are all really disregarding. He mentions the Munich Charter of 1971 about a certain degree of impartiality and an ethical behavior, as it were. Anyway, and he ends up by saying, well, look where we are now. Ursula von der Leyen, he says, I don't know whether to emphasize her stupidity or her corruption. But he says now, all we have at the moment, what we see, is the degree of submission of the European Union to the United States. And he goes on for a long time arguing that Europe has become a vassal, and we have these deficits, and our economy is going down. And he says, and now they're just telling us that there is no other choice but to drink of this chalice. And America has lost. He points this out clearly. And not only that, but they are, in his words, spitting out Zelensky and all that narrative. Anyway, so he goes on for a long time. I just wanted to mention him, if you can follow him, because he's rather amusing. Very good teacher, and he keeps your attention going. The second, as I said, is Professor Michael Hudson, and he's being interviewed by Dialogue Works, the channel. And just a few things that he says here. He says that the whole thing was basically let me put this here so I can read my notes. That the whole thing really was based, as the war, the reason for the war was based on a fantasy. It was based on draining Russia, depleting Russia capacity, military and economic and otherwise. He says US had no understanding of how large Russian manufacturing was. So they fully expected that perhaps Ukraine would march into Moscow. He says all this was a fantasy, not an end game. Those who understood this in the State Department and in America, he says, and they were arguing against it, were actually fired. What happened is that if you didn't think that, the attitude was, if you don't think that the US can win, then, we don't need you here, because what we need is people who actually believe in America, and obviously you don't, so you're taking the pro-Russian side, so they were replaced. So the result was, he says, that all the people there, advisors and so on, were just flag wavers, he says, representing finance capitalism. The interviewer asks him about the sanctions, the purpose of the sanctions. And he says, amazingly, when I heard this, I thought, what? He says, the war in Ukraine was not a war against just Russia. it was also a war against NATO. NATO? No. Yes, he explains. The US had a nightmare. Germany and other European countries were going to see their road to prosperity to be with increasing trade and investment with Russia. The Germans had an idea that they were going to export their automobiles, their washing machines, their industry, consumer goods, to Russia at a high price. And in exchange, of course, Russia would get this money to pay them by selling them oil and gas at a very low price to Germany. And it was a sort of a circular flow of raw materials and industrial goods. And that would make Europe increasingly prosperous, but that prosperity could be also shared with Asia and Eurasia and even Asia, along with China even, and leave the United States thought, and that would leave the US behind. And so the sanctions against Russia, he argues, were an American attempt to say, we are going to build an iron curtain here, to make an iron curtain here, a new one, between Europe and Russia. And this iron curtain is to prevent you, Germany and Europe, from making money with Russia. If you're going to trade, it has to be with us. He says this in a sort of an amusing, laughing way. He's being a bit sarcastic, but that is his conclusion. If you're going to trade, it has to be with us. So instead of buying Russian natural gas and oil, you will be dependent on us, on American liquefied natural gas, at 3 times the price, of course. So you will have to spend, in case you didn't know, $5 billion making ports large enough to accept the containers, ships, with the liquefied natural gas that we will send you. And we will have, besides all that, we will have the power to turn that gas off at any point in case you ever wanted to vote, for socialism, let's say, against our interests. So we can get complete control over you. So he says the sanctions against Russia were to draw a rope around Europe to tie it into dependency against Russia and into dependency into the US economy. And that was the aim. The effect, of course, he continues, was indeed to bring German industrialization to an end, because without Russian gas and dependent upon Russian gas, it is bringing Germany to its knees. Because if you look, he says, at the balance of payments of Europe, this balance of payments was largely supported by German exports and industrial exports. And one of the reasons that Germany was so interested in the Eurozone, for example, was that without having your currency tied to, let's say, the French or the Italian or the Dutch and other economies, the German mark would have gone up, and that would have priced German export out of the market. But by being tied to the rest of Europe, you would have the Southern European countries running a deficit, always, keeping the euro's exchange rate low enough so that Germany was not priced out of the market. as it run a big trade, investment surplus. So the effect all of a sudden was that denying Germany from the source of energy that prevented, excuse me, here, just a second, sorry about that, denying Germany from the source of energy, that prevented Germany from running a surplus, and that means that the European balance of payments was drained in the process, and now you're going to have a weakening European euro and more problems. And he goes on for a long time explaining about deficits and so on. Then another question: what was the effect on Russia, the sanctions? Very interesting. He says the sanctions against any country almost always backfires, because sanctions are pretty much like having, let's say, protective tariffs for the country. He explains, when America told the Baltic states, stop exporting your cheese, your food, your grain, crops to Russia, when they told them that, what did Russia do? Well, they didn't starve. They didn't starve to death. They said, okay, so let's start our own cheese industry. And now it no longer depends on Lithuania for cheese or anything else. The same with Europe and its agricultural policy. The effect, the result, he says, was to make Russia independent of the Eurozone and increasingly self-reliant. Russia has my telephone. Russia has lost its export income for oil and gas, to be sure, but it no longer has to pay the import charges of its food and the other products that it was getting before the sanctions, because it's producing this at home now. So basically, it is as if, he explains, as if President Biden had said to President Putin, President Putin, we love you. We want to help you. We are going to help you so much. We're going to help you to get rich in Russia. In the same way we got rich in America, in the United States, we are going to help you with protective tariffs. Now, I know you don't want to put protective tariffs and you're against it, but let me explain to you why you should have them. Since you will not do it yourselves, we're going to help you do this, as we ourselves did in America in the 19th century. We are going to put sanctions on you, you see, and that will help you to develop your own industry, and you'll end up getting rich, just as the US did. And he says this has been the result that we have all seen. Russia is now much more independent and strong, and there is no power that the US or the UE can impose, no further sanctions that they can impose on them. Well, I think Ursula von der Leyen has just put another, I think it's the 13th sanctions, I think is screwdrivers or nails or something like that, sanctioned. Anyway, so the next question is about the European Union. Is it under the thumb of US foreign policy? That was the question. And Professor Hudson says, look, the US has interfered in European affairs certainly since 1945. He says, I remember when I first went to Berlin, and there was a big hill in Berlin, and that was the accumulation of all the rubble and the destruction that had been caused, and all the the rubbish had been put all up on a hill, and I don't know where it is exactly, but there it is. And he says, well, now you see, on top of that big hill, the US built spy satellites. And we all remember how a decade ago Americans were listening to Angela Merkel's telephone conversations. He came out, we all heard the news. He says, in fact, the US listens to just about every politician's conversations. They also have, so they know where everyone is and what everyone is thinking. They also have, he says, scouts. What are these scouts? It's an association, the American Endowment for Democracy, meaning the United States neoliberal world order globalist democracy, the globalist, okay? These people have a scouts. They look for people like, for example, Ursula von der Leyen or Angelina Baerbock, and we could add just about everybody, because we now see that they have been selected beforehand. Think of just about anybody. People, in other words, who have the promise of being opportunistic. They're clever, though not wise, perhaps. Those are my words. And basically to throw their career in line with US interest. The US has set up throughout Europe many non-governmental organizations, and you could basically call them talent scouts organizations, looking for promising entrepreneurial people, ambitious, opportunistic, and so on, business people and politicians, and people also in the European media, obviously. And European Union leaders do not really, he says, do not really represent business interest, the European business interest or the economy. They are not really representing the European people at all. They represent, he says, I won't say they are employers, but the US foundations that have been promoting their careers and all these decades. I've been told, he says, by a Treasury official that the US can always get whatever they want from Europe. He says because its politicians are probably, quote, the most corrupt politicians. He says, sorry, all the other countries, India, Pakistan, etc. But Europe, according to this American Treasury official, he says they sell out cheaper. And he was laughing, he says, but obviously exaggerating, but as a joke, he says, all you need is an envelope with a few $100 bills, and you will have the policy that the United States approves. Because he says European policy is disguised, is designed in the US, and then it is put in the hands of European councils and politicians. The euro, for example, was designed as a satellite currency for the US dollar by Robert Mandel at the University of Chicago. And it was designed basically as an anti-labor policy and anti-industrial policy following the US finance capital model. It locks in Europe into a satellite status. Goodness gracious. So, the last question, they go on for a long time, it's over an hour, but my last question here, the question that he was asked was, what would you advise to the Europeans? What can Europe do now? And he says, leave. Oh, goodness gracious. Leave, he says, just go to Russia or even China, just leave. He says, Donald Rumsfeld, the former head of the Federal Reserve, he says, refer to old Europe as a dead zone. He says the Eurozone is dead. It cannot be revived without a radical restructuring, and it is not going to restructure. It is on a suicidal trajectory. All of you, all that you can do, he says, is get out of the sinking ship. And he gives a number of examples of why it is just going down. But you see, don't expect restructuring of very much, because there is no way you can get out of the US dependency, given the corruption of the politicians and the fact that basically Europe does not have an economic theory, an economic doctrine that is an alternative to neoliberalism. It goes on for another hour, so but those perhaps I will go back and share other thoughts that he has, but very interesting. The third that I'm going to share with you is, as I said, another Frenchman, a French diplomat, Jacques Bourde. He has written very many books. You might check him out. And he talks about the present catastrophe in Gaza. And he says, first of all, Europe has the, let's say, luxury of not being emotionally involved. Not to the extent, obviously, that other parties have. So he says, perhaps we should take the opportunity to look at it in a what do I want to say? Not emotionally, in a detached manner. Perhaps we are in a better position to do this. And he starts by saying, okay, let us say about Hamas, for example, define as a terrorist organization. Okay, so he says, okay, let's look at what we mean by that, because the word terrorism, it is not sometimes clearly defined. He says, there is a difference between a, let's say, terrorist movement and a terrorist organization, a resistance organization and a terrorist organization. I hope I got it right. He says the movement has an objective at the end, has a final objective. A terrorist organization is simply, you're referring to the methods that they use. Okay, so one is called terrorist because it goes against, obviously, a given situation, but it has an objective in mind. The other, a terrorist movement, could be an organization that has no actual objective in mind, perhaps only to terrify it, but it refers to the methods that they use. He says, but we are using terrorism in a very sort of loose way, mainly as a means of stigmatizing, okay, what this particular group is doing without seeing why. Is it the method or is it the objective that you are concerned about? And then goes a little bit into the history of Hamas. Hamas was created in 1987 Since 2005, it has been established in Gaza. The Israeli army has carried out, I'm reading my notes, has carried out more than 15 operations in the Gaza Strip and never really managed to defeat it. And he goes on to explain what many commentators are saying, that it is the idea of fighting against something that, you know, you can kill all the terrorists, but then the idea will continue with the other ones. So that is why it's so difficult to defeat it unless you address the cause problem kind of thing. So he says it is not enough to use just qualifiers and adjectives in order to say how bad they are. That doesn't solve anything, because the qualifiers, the adjectives, are not going to give us any indication of the way in which to fight the movement. Doesn't solve anything. Insult them or call them whatever you want, but it doesn't give you any indication of how to solve it. He says the word terrorist is used sometimes rather lightly in some areas where that in several situations that might be very different. The methods might be very different from one organization to another, but we just call them all terrorists, and so we're not clear on how to address the problem. What else that he has? And that does he say? Okay, the word Hamas, actually, Hamas resistance means it means actually resistance. Now, it just so happens that the resolution, the United Nations resolution 45/130, if I copied this right, in 1990, give the Palestinians the legitimacy of resistance to the Israel occupation. It gives the Palestinians the legitimacy of resistance to the Israeli occupation. Okay, so resisting is legal. The problem is, how do you resist? Yeah, and some people will choose one way, and if that doesn't work, we'll choose another. I guess that's the problem. So some obviously have chosen armed struggle. He mentioned, he goes on about this for a while. He says that the United States and Israel, in his mind, as a diplomat, in his mind, lack a certain nuance, which is a nice way of putting it. That he refers to Israel's arrogance, perhaps, and the U.S. Congress as a sort of almost a religion, under the influence of these what they call Calvinist evangelists or something like that, who are talking about the Third Temple. I think I've talked about that in another video. But anyway, he says, okay, the main reason for resentment is the feeling of injustice. And sometimes we use terms, he says, without thinking of the consequences. We should use these terms with some discernment. He points out, however, that the thing about Israel is that it's the country with no borders. That the Zionists actually did it on purpose. They did not define their borders. What else does he say? Yes, that since they have the right to resist, we can of course differ on the means to do so. But it is legitimate to resist a state that has never respected its commitments, he says, or international law, and it has never defined its borders. Hamas cannot recognize, he says, cannot easily recognize the authority of Israel over the land that it considers its own. And one of the founders of Israel, the Zionist Ben-Gurion and his cabinet, actually addressed the issue of borders and decided not to include it in the constitution because they could evolve. If you are claiming the same territory, then how to embark upon this dispute? He says for Europeans, we should moderate the enthusiasm with which many approach this conflict. Avoid labels, good and bad, because that doesn't help to moderate issues. We have the privilege, he ends, to be out of the conflict, the privilege of the one who can distance himself, who has the perhaps luxury of not getting emotionally involved, as I said, in the conflict. One terrorist, the other born of a terrorist movement, and so on. So, what do you think about this? I find them extremely interesting. I am myself learning a lot. I hope this has been interesting for you to follow up on all this, and I will put the 3 videos down below if you want to listen to them. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.